Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining me. My name's Tim. I'm a historian here at the Edison and Ford Winter Estates, and I'm glad you're joining on my session as we step back into history. We're going to be taking a look at the railroad's arrival into Fort Myers. I would love to thank Holly Schaefer, our program manager and my boss, for giving me the opportunity to share my research with you. She is an ardent historian. She's a supporter of history and research, and we're very grateful that we have her here to help us with all of our topics. The arrival of the railroad to Fort Myers not only changed the town's economy, but it also altered its legacy, history, and social makeup. It set this tiny little town on a trajectory to transform all of Southwest Florida, all the way down to Naples. Now, Thomas Edison, I got to link this up to the Edison Winter Estates here also. So I just want to fill you in. He loved the railroad. He grew up working on a commuter line connecting Port Huron, Michigan to Detroit. He learned his profession of telegraphy by ingratiating himself with the telegraphers on that railroad line. And by 1880, Edison had his own electric train at his Menlo Park, New Jersey complex. So he would cart things around his complex on his own electric train. He was always fascinated by the railroad. One of the reasons I got interested in this topic myself. Okay, so let's talk about how the railroad got to Fort Myers. The Florida Southern Railroad connected Lakeland to Bartow originally, and then eventually down to Punta Gorda. I got a little map of it there showing the line, and there's a picture of the Lakeland Depot. So that's where it all begins for Fort Myers, believe it or not. In 1882, this man, Henry B. Plant, formed the Plant Investment Company. He headquartered it in Sanford, Florida, with the investment support of Pico. That's what I'm calling his investment company. He had some pretty wealthy investors, people like Henry Flagler, Mr. Jessup, W.T. Walters, and Henry Plant acquired existing rail lines and laid new track into central and western Florida. He called it the Florida Southern Railroad. In 1879, he purchased his first railroad, the Atlantic and Gulf, in Savannah, Georgia. He reorganized the line as the Savannah, Florida, and Western Railway with a branch leading to Live Oak, Florida. So he had a vision for Florida. Henry Plant. Most of the rails before Mr. Plant took over would just cross the panhandle portion of the state, but he saw the potential of opening up the entire state of Florida. Now, as soon as Plant announced that he might move his railroad down to Punta Gorda, the people of Fort Myers already started to petition. They wanted the railroad to come here instead of Punta Gorda. Don't underestimate the power of Punta Gorda in this story, because Punta Gorda, Charlotte Harbor, is the second largest estuary in the state of Florida, and they almost got the railroad before Tampa did. But a guy named Isaac H. Trabu went to Boston to discuss the matter with members of the board of directors of the Florida Southern. That's where their company was centered. The railroad president telegraphed me to come. This is a quote now from Mr. Trabu, and he's giving the news. The railroad president telegraphed me to come here to see if we could negotiate about the terminus of the road. I came, and I think that we will get the terminus opposite a 14-foot buoy. Their notion is to make a city on the Punta Gorda Peninsula if they go to Trabu. That was his town, a town that Isaac had started. He was already selling lots. The only problem was no one was buying any of the lots there. So they say that they have big offers to go to Hickory Bluff, and if I don't deal liberally with them, they will go to Hickory Bluff or to Pine Island. So He went there to petition the railroad guys in Boston to build this Florida right through his property. And eventually he wrote his cousin and he said, if they come to our place, they will cross through your homestead. And if you will only keep it, it will make you a rich man. So keep it, all of it. The roadmen don't want it known in Manatee County that I have been here to see them. So this was Charlotte County back then, part of Manatee County. That was the county that Punta Gorda was located in. And so you see why they were getting special preference for the railroad, because he had the foresight to go up there and talk them into it. Fort Myers had no one to represent them in this issue. So there's Henry B. Plant. He was the founder of the Punta Gorda Hotel. That was his grand hotel in Punta Gorda, and this is where he wanted to end his rail line. He had no intention of bringing it down to Fort Myers. Built a huge 150-room hotel in Punta Gorda. On January 26th, Vice President D.F. Jack of the plant system hinted that if Lee County would donate $40,000 to the system, the railroad might be provided down here to Fort Myers. Unfortunately, Lee County didn't have that kind of money here. The local businessmen not that wealthy, so that pretty much closed the case for Lee County at the time. On Wednesday, June 28, 1899, Lee County's fate would change forever. That is when Henry B. Plant died. And at that moment, it set in place a chain of events that would eventually lead Fort Myers to getting the railroad they so desperately desired. Now, Fort Myers definitely had been begging the Florida Southern Railroad to come to Fort Myers. And finally, what happens, you get a map of why Mr. Plant there. These were the three leading hotels in Florida at the time. Charlotte Harbor was the second largest estuary. You can see that on the screen there. There's Tampa, and just below it, Charlotte Harbor. This is a map of Florida that shows the locations of the three winter resorts in 1885. Sanford, Jacksonville, and Tallahassee, all financed by Mr. Plant. And the Sanford House was considered the finest of all of them at the time. Now, when Mr. Plant died on April 4th, 1902, the vast holdings of the Plant system, valued at approximately $25 million, were purchased by the Atlantic Coastline Railroad. And that changes everything. Shortly after the purchase, Walter G. Langford, that is the man you see on the screen, acting for a group of Fort Myers leaders, began writing to the coastline officials. In July, Atlantic Coastline sent P.F. Jenkins, their construction engineer of the road, to come to Fort Myers and look the situation over. He arrived on July 30th after being escorted by Fort Myers boosters, praising the region's proximity to sandy beaches, all the economic opportunities. Jenkins made a favorable report to the coastline directors. So Walter G. Langford is giving the credit for convincing the Atlantic Coastline to come here to Fort Myers. He was a local businessman. You can see his bank still standing down on First Strength. He gave the city a sense of sophistication with the First National Bank. Also, it had the first explosive-proof safe in that bank. So Walter G. Langford, one of the leaders in getting the railroad here to Fort Myers. On August 3rd, it was announced that the line would come to Fort Myers with a spur up the river, providing a right-of-way and a depot site would be furnished. So we'll build the railroad, but you got to give us some land to do it on. Now, they weren't expecting the land for free. To obtain the land required, the town leaders organized Fort Myers' first Board of Trade. February 12, 1903, they met at the Royal Palm Hotel. That was the luxury hotel Mr. Plant also had a hand in building that hotel along with Hugh O'Neil. So I always equate the Board of Trade as of course, the town leaders that started to put it in as mild terms as possible, strong arm the local property owners into selling some land so they could get the railroad here. These are the men that had a vision for Fort Myers. They saw Fort Myers as a much bigger place than a little cattle port. So they played a huge role in this. Weekly reports in the news press began during the summer months of 1903, building great suspense, raising hopes for local farmers wishing to unload their citrus crops to the northern markets via this new rail system. As a matter of fact, they're expecting to ship off over 100,000 boxes of citrus that year. Now, citrus growers along the Orange and Caloosahatchee rivers were ready. Unfortunately, the railroad wasn't, but they also knew that the steamboats were not expected to be able to handle that amount. So the ACL Railroad was unable to secure the iron for the bridge construction before January. But you can see here locally, they were getting weekly reports, front page Fort Myers Press about the railroad's progress. Right around this time, October 15th, Mrs. Gonzalez steps into the picture. 6 months of persuading local landowners to sell the required land to the railroad successfully culminated with Mrs. Gonzalez agreeing to sell her lot down on Monroe and Main Street for $6,000. So she held out for $1,000 more. You can see the write-up there in the paper. They offered her $5,000. She held out until she finally got $6,000, her and her sons. And as you can see in the paper, it says, this is a very satisfactory outcome for all concerned and will give the company a fine site for the depot. So that's where the depot was going to be located, on the corner of Monroe and Main Street, Fort Myers. So excitement's really building now, because the people of Fort Myers are very excited. Every time they talk about the railroad, crowds of people gather around. At the same time that the final property sale was being done, the American Bridge Company announced its first delivery of pilings to cross over the river. This is October 15th, 1903. The American Bridge Company was a J.P. Morgan engineered merger of 28 steel companies. They originated in 1900. On April 1st, 1901, the American Bridge became a subsidiary of the United States Steel Company, another company owned by J.P. Morgan, where it was incorporated in the state of Delaware. So they went all the way up to Delaware, find someone to build this bridge across the river. Railroad workers, oh, this is an interesting side note. Now, the people didn't need a lot of incentive to welcome the railroad, but adding on to the romance of the story, you can see here 40 African-American railroad workers rescued Fort Myers from a great fire. The entire city almost burned down. They came at the last minute. Now, as the paper reported, everyone had pretty much given up on saving the town at this point. Even women and children were helping to pump water from the river. The railroad workers arrived just in time, took over the fire rescue. They had enough energy and they were able to save the town from being destroyed. Interestingly enough, about the 1903 fire, the first building to be lost was the fire station. So the railroad added on to its ambiance, or heroship, I should say, by saving the town from burning down. So that only added on to everyone's excitement. Now, the bridge and the trestle over the river was 5,000 feet in length. And it was finally completed March 31st, 1904. And there's a current picture of the bridge. It started out as a swing bridge, and in 1977, it was upgraded into a drawbridge. It has wooden trestles approaching it from north to south. They're currently rebuilding the tracks that were destroyed by Hurricane Ian. The bridge still stands. When you drive over the I-75 bridge, look down and you'll see this railroad bridge still suspended up in air. It's drawn up, but they are currently working on the tracks approaching it from the northern side of the river. Okay, so excitement is huge right now at Fort Myers. At this time in 1904, weekly write-ups continue in the Fort Myers Press, which build up the excitement amongst local citizens, culminating in Mrs. Hendry driving home the final spike. Mrs. Hendry, one of the town founders, her husband, very prominent here locally. I have her circled there in that photograph. So you see there's probably about 100 people gathered to watch her drive home the Golden Spike. The railroad finally gets to Fort Myers. This was February 20th, 1904. Church bells rang and cannons boomed. There was a huge party. Mrs. Evans prepared a treat for the railroad men. She served sandwiches, sausages, hot dogs, cookies, a box of 500 oranges, cigars, all furnished by local businessmen. So this was a huge celebration. Everyone's so happy that the railroad arrived. Front page news, obviously. And here you go. On Tuesday, May 10th, 1904, the first passenger service began. 100 citizens gathered to greet the train. There were 25 passengers on the train. Again, a big party. Refreshments were served again. And here we go. Fort Myers is now on the map. People are coming down from northern destinations. That's the hope. And don't worry, that hope came to fruition on July 11th. They finally advertised the train to Fort Myers at northern ports, and the first excursion comes into town on Monday, July 11th. It brought 1,750 people. That was thought to be, they were at first expecting many African Americans to come because they were having an event with prominent Black ministers scheduled to speak for the Allen Christian Endeavor League. And much to everyone else's surprise, 15 passenger cars roll into town with over 1,700 people, both black and white, crowding the streets of Fort Myers. They were not prepared for this day. The local businesses quickly had to throw together some food and refreshments to entertain all these people in downtown Fort Myers. And the advent of the railroad to Fort Myers brought new social and economic activities to the area. So this was huge. What a mistake, it said in the paper. They had no idea. When they say what a mistake, they just thought that they were going to get like 100 people arriving, and instead they get 1,750. So the people of Fort Myers are overjoyed. The railroad actually becomes one of the social epicenters of Fort Myers at this point. There's a look at the Monroe and Main Street depot that the Atlantic Coastline built downtown Fort Myers. They also continued it out into the river. So the tracks didn't just stop at Monroe and Main Street. They went out into the river where they had packing houses. They had packed citrus fruits out there. They brought in freshwater catch from Lake Okeechobee, filled up train cars, and shipped them up north right from Monroe and Main Streets. Just beyond First Street is where the banks of the river once were. So this became a huge thing. One of the biggest industries, freshwater fishing, became the new economic boon in town. The industry was started by Captain B.F. Hall Jr., owner of a small steamer, the Naomi III. After installing a large refrigerator in his boat, he began making semi-weekly trips to Lake Okeechobee, December 1904, where he kept a crew of men busy catching fish. Eventually, that would blossom into over 165 people employed out at Lake Go. On December 23rd, the first of an array of circuses arrived over the river. And this started a whole new phase of culture here in Fort Myers. Circuses like the Sun Brothers, Jones Brothers, Miles Wharton Dog and Pony Show, just a few. Not to be outdone by the circus, the Four Picket Stock Company that was live plays arrived in town also. The touring company gave 7 performances: A Wife's Peril, Miss Little, Charlie's Aunt, Police Alarm, Little Ford, and many others. So this was now a place of culture. Suddenly, of course, people like Edison, Ford would go down to the Arcade Theater eventually because the railroad had brought in a whole new era of entertainment here. And Fort Myers provided an ample market for all these new cultural activities. Here you see some front page news here. Thomas Edison finally comes by train, right? And he didn't just come by train. He came for the very first time in 1906 by train, and eventually they would make this a regular way to come into town. So they made their trip here in 1906. February 28th is when they arrived. The Wizard and his family here for a 6-week stay. So now that the train is connecting Fort Myers, the Edisons are more inclined to come regularly. Mina thought the trip was very arduous and had even thought about not coming here at all in 1906, but because they had a train that would bring them 1 mile from their estate, she decided that it was worth making the trip that year. The arrival of the rail also inspired local investors to improve the physical appearance of the town. Local downtown businesses, they pushed to replace shell sidewalks with hard cement, complaining that the shells were washed away frequently during rainstorms. Now, the people of Fort Myers not so inclined to pay for this. So after much infighting, business and private property owners, a special levy was eventually passed to raise the funding, and the cement sidewalk project was completed by 1906. So now we've got hard sidewalks. You see brick buildings starting to appear in town. Fort Myers is now changing its look to accommodate its northern visitors. Along with the paved sidewalks and roads came modern structures. You have a look at the Bradford Hotel. That was a 41-room building. August 1904, it was completed. In November 1905, as well as the stone block on the corner of First and Henry Street. These buildings added a tone of modernity to the town. The Bradford Hotel was built by Harvey E. Heitman and financed by Tootie McGregor, winter resident here at our estates, widow of Ambrose McGregor. The hotel was named for their deceased son, Bradford, and it's located at the corner of First and Henry Streets. Occupies the entire block today. The Bradford originally had 41 rooms and was opened November 12th, 1905. So when you're dining down on First Street, you'll notice the Arcade Theater located in the downstairs level of the Bradford Hotel. You'll also notice the stone block building still standing in downtown Fort Myers. So this is the look that the town begins to take on thanks to the railroad's arrival. You got to look at the Model Ts that were delivered at the Monroe Street Depot in 1915. So now they're no longer having to ship cars in on steamers. They can bring them by rail. This opens up a whole new market. Of course, we have a 1916 Model T right here in our museum, furnished by the local Ford dealer. So they're unloading these things off the trains these days. And you have a look at Thomas Edison and family. This is their big 1914 trip down here. Now, by this time, every time a train arrives into Fort Myers, hundreds of people gather at the depot just to get a look-see at who might be getting off the train. In 1914, though, word was leaked out. There was a special visitor arriving with Thomas Edison and his family, and that would be Henry Ford, along with his friend John Burroughs. They're greeted by 2,000 people down at the depot on Monroe Street, 31 Ford automobiles, and paraded them around town. So this was big news when they arrived down at the train station. We have another picture of the arcade theater, first constructed in the Bradford Hotel building in 1915, and this became the center for cultural entertainment. And I might add, it still is today, downtown Fort Myers, where they perform many different plays there. And if you're here visiting us, don't forget to check out what's on the bill at the Arcade Theater, a cultural icon here. And we got to look at how the town continued to modernize because of the railroad. This is a picture of downtown Fort Myers in the 1950s. That is, I believe, First Street right there with the Bradford Hotel. There's the Bradford Hotel over there on the corner to the left-hand side of the picture. So you can see things are starting to progress well. They got paved roads now. As a matter of fact, the local businessmen took out personal loans to have the roads paved in downtown Fort Myers in the early 1900s. Okay, so the impact of the railroad, of course, Baron Collier also comes to town thanks to the Atlantic Coastline Railroad in 1922. And he offered Fort Myers, he and Fort Myers businessmen bought into the Southern Railway as a joint venture to the ACL. So they all are willing to invest. They want to construct a railroad to Naples. The company reached Bonita Springs on October 8th, 1924, and Western Naples in January 1927. So the Atlantic coastline has now expanded all the way down to Naples. Baron Collier, a big reason for that, along with Harvey Heitman and other local investors. So they convinced the Atlantic coastline, not Fort Myers isn't the end of the world here. There's still other places to tap into. The traffic in Fort Myers became so great by 1924 that they built a new train station to handle this. A modern $100,000 terminal was constructed in town with a much larger capacity, along with modern amenities and comfortable seating, areas for people when they were waiting to board. And it was a big welcome for this new train station, a noisy welcome given to the first train depot to arrive at Fort Myers. 3,000 people attended, along with the Fort Myers concert band and a movie crew. So this was big news here in Fort Myers when the new grand opening of the new ACL railway station. There's a couple pictures of that day. You can see the people lined up around for the big celebration, and many of these people came in on the rails also. A look at the new train station on the day it was opened. So it was big news here in Fort Myers, and this became a huge center, cultural center. As a matter of fact, in 1929, when Henry Ford arrived at Fort Myers, crowds gathered around this train station, but Henry Ford duped them by going to the Seaboard Airline Railway Station instead. So new competition in town. On January 7th, 1927, Seaboard's chairman, Davies Warfield, took a large faction of dignitaries on a special run of his train. He called it the Orange Blossom Special, beginning at Arcadia and proceeded south to Naples. This was the opening of the rail line, the Seaboard Airline Railway. So new competition for the Atlantic coastline. They even built their own depot here in Fort Myers. 5 editions of the Orange Blossom Special were used to transport 700 people on this day, January 7th, 1927. And they made a stop off here in Fort Myers, eventually landing in Naples. The Orange Blossom Special was touted as a beautiful, luxurious line. You can take a look at the passenger station, upper right-hand corner, that Seaboard Airline built. They built that on the intersection of Palm Beach Boulevard and State Road and East Riverside Drive. This building was tore down, I think, 2 years ago. And they also built a freight depot less than a mile away on Michigan Avenue. So now we have 2 train depots in town. We have 2 freight depots in town, and the competition is on. And the Orange Blossom Special, now they truly were a luxury train, as truly deluxe train setting in the highest attainable standards. This is a quote from their brochure. They would offer salons, bar service, dining cars, Pullman sleeping cars. So when you came on the Orange Blossom Special, you were in luxury. One of the reasons Henry Ford chose the Seaboard Express instead of the Atlantic Coastline. Now, the Seaboard Airlines passenger depot stopped service in 1952. In 1967, the Atlantic Coastline and the Seaboard Airline merged into one company, the Seaboard Coastline. So that was when both railroads merged. No need to compete anymore for the market here in Fort Myers. You got to look at the Seaboard Coastline. They featured some pretty massive trains. Now, the age of the railroad passenger service was over by the 1950s, beaten out by improved airline service and highways, as well as the formation of Amtrak. The Seaboard Coastline ended passenger service in Southwest Florida in May of 1971. Further industry consolidation led to the 1980 merger of the Seaboard Coastline with the Chessie system and other railroads to form the CSX. So 1971 ended an era of passenger train service to Fort Myers. And you have a look at the CSX line, the Chessie system, which still is in the area today. Of course, the Seminole Gulf Railway has bought out that system, and they are the new guy in town. It's a short line freight and passenger excursion railroad headquartered in Fort Myers. So this Seminole Gulf Railway's headquarters right here in town. You can see their headquarters right around Colonial. It operates 2 former CSX transportation railroad lines in Southwest Florida. While the railroads of the early 20th century have been replaced by air and automobile travel to Southwest Florida, it was the railroad that helped introduce millions of Americans to the warm winters and emerald waters of Southwest Florida. Now, the once tiny little backcountry town of Fort Myers became the gateway to Southwest Florida. And it was made this the winter home for many famous people, tourists. It became the major tourist town that we are today, all thanks to the railroad opening up the town of Fort Myers. So this is pretty much the impact of the railroad here in Southwest Florida. And to this day, because of the railroad's arrival to Fort Myers, Punta Gorda has been left behind in the dust. Unfortunately for Punta Gorda, Fort Myers has become the major destination here in Southwest Florida. Not to mention, the gateway to Naples was opened right here by the Atlantic Coastline. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Now, if you're wondering where I got all my information, there's where it came from. It was about a month-long research project here that culminated in my presentation. Thanks for joining us today.